It is the 30th of April 1945. The armies of the Soviet Union close in on the center of Berlin. Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third Reich, commits suicide in the Reich Chancellery bunker, along with his wife, Eva Braun. His remaining supporters either flee or choose to follow their master into oblivion. One of these men, the most loyal of all of Hitler's entourage, decides with his wife that the post-Nazi world is not worth living in. The next day, after poisoning his own children in their beds, he commits suicide himself, next to the grave of his beloved Führer. His name, Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda. The man known to history as Paul Joseph Goebbels was born in the town of Reith in western Germany on the 29th of October 1897. He was born into a modest family, and his background was quite unremarkable. His father, Fritz Goebbels, worked in the local wick factory and eventually rose to become a foreman there. His mother, Katharina Maria Oldenhausen, was half Dutch. The daughter of a blacksmith, Katharina had a close connection with her son, and she and Joseph remained close throughout his life. Both Joseph's parents were devoted Roman Catholics, though later in his life Goebbels had to persistently refute allegations they were partly Jewish. The family was solidly lower middle class, enough that a family piano was purchased in 1909, a symbol of their upwardly mobile aspirations. But Fritz Goebbels was earning just 4,000 marks annually and had no liquid assets. Consequently, the young Joseph did not come from any significant wealth, and his early life was characterized by efforts to attain a greater financial and social position. Goebbels suffered from ill health as a child. He had a club foot that he acquired in his early years, following a bout of osteomyelitis, a swelling of the bone marrow, and he also had lung problems. This left his leg deformed for the remainder of his life. Much of his later psychology was shaped by insecurities about his health problems and lack of athleticism. This was compounded by his rejection for military service when he sought to enlist in the German army at the height of the First World War. His later writings are suffused with statements that make it clear he was attempting throughout his life to compensate for his physical deformity through his literary and political ambitions. The world in which Joseph Goebbels reached his teenage years, and then young manhood in, was one of turmoil. In the summer of 1914, crisis enveloped Europe when a regional diplomatic crisis in the Balkans expanded to lead to a war involving all of Europe's major powers. On one side were arrayed Britain, France, Italy, and Russia, with the United States joining these allied powers in 1917. On the other, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire formed an alliance known as the Central Powers. As a native of Western Germany, Goebbels would have spent his early years watching German soldiers passing through on trains towards the Western Front in northeast France, where the bulk of the fighting took place in horrific trench warfare between 1914 and 1918. Consequently, his spurning by the military in his formative years was a difficult experience for the young Goebbels. Germany eventually lost the war in November 1918, and was forced into a highly punitive series of peace treaties the following year, generally referred to under the umbrella terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The German Reich was stripped of a huge amount of its territory, which was granted to other countries, and made up much of the new country of Poland, formed to the east of Germany after the war ended. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was also forced to pay punitive monetary remuneration to France and Britain for its alleged fault in causing the war. Furthermore, Germany was forced to reduce its army to a tiny contingent of men, and was prohibited from remilitarizing the Rhineland region of Western Germany. The terms were negotiated by the government of the Weimar Republic, which was formed in Germany following the dissolution of the Second German Reich or Empire, named after the town in central Germany where the new republic was formed early in 1919. In time, Weimar would become a derogatory term for those who had negotiated Germany's humiliating surrender to the Allied powers, and the architects of the peace became known as the November Criminals. Goebbels' life in the years that followed was highly formative for him. For a while, he considered entering the priesthood, but his commitment to his parents' Catholicism cooled eventually. He also spent periods of time at multiple universities at Bonn, Munich, Würzburg, and Freiburg, before eventually earning a PhD in German philology from Heidelberg University in 1921 at just 24 years of age. He would later publish this work, just one of 14 books he had written by 1940. Following his time at Heidelberg, Goebbels attempted to establish himself in the early 1920s variously as a journalist, novelist, and playwright, but he was broadly unsuccessful in his endeavors, somewhat like Hitler, who had aspired to become a watercolor artist in his early years. Goebbels had sought a career in the arts and literature through his writing, but was frustrated in his efforts. As this occurred, he became increasingly disaffected in the course of 1923 and 1924. Like many other young men who were disillusioned with life in post-war Germany, Goebbels found himself drawn to a new political party in Bavaria which had earned a reputation for controversy in a short period of time. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, had been established in Munich in 1920. Its goals were the overturning of the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the war, German rearmament, and re-expansion of the German state into Eastern Europe. From its earliest day, the Nazi Party was also an extremely anti-Semitic party and envisaged the total exclusion of the Jewish community from German life. It was led by a young Austrian called Adolf Hitler. Under his leadership, the Nazis attempted a failed coup d'etat in Munich on the 8th of November 1923. The Beer Hall Putsch, as it became known, was quickly snuffed out on the 9th of November by the regional authorities. Hitler and some of his closest associates were tried for treason in March 1924 and imprisoned. The abortive revolt possibly drew Goebbels to the Nazis. He had been moving increasingly in right-wing political circles throughout 1924. His radicalization at this time may also have been owing to the occupation of the Ruhr area of Western Germany by French and Belgian troops between January 1923 and August 1925 in response to Germany defaulting on its war reparations payments. On the 22nd of October 1924, the Goebbels family home in Reith was searched by Belgian police, and the following day Goebbels himself was interrogated by the occupation police. It is hardly coincidental that 2 weeks later, in November 1924, he wrote and published an article in a newspaper, the Völkische Freiheit, in which he called for Hitler's early release from prison. Hitler was indeed released early on the 20th of December 1924, by which time Goebbels had joined the Nazi Party, beginning the association which would dominate the remainder of his life. Goebbels' role in the Nazi Party grew in the years that followed. We know a great deal about his life from the mid-20s through Goebbels' own writings. Starting in 1923, he kept a series of extensive diaries unbroken for 22 years down to his death in 1945. These diaries were taken to Russia after the war and have only become fully available since 2008. Stretching to 32 volumes in the modern print editions, they provide a uniquely detailed insight into the life, career, and thoughts of one of the leading members of the Nazi leadership. They also provide what one of the foremost historians of Nazi Germany, Ian Kershaw, has deemed a vitally important source of insight into Hitler's thinking and action, particularly in his ascent to power in the 1920s and early 1930s. The diaries give extensive details of Goebbels' career in the initial years of his membership of the Nazi Party. In his early days, he was under the patronage of Gregor Strasser, a leading member of the party, who led a branch of the Nazis that leaned more towards socialism and anti-capitalism, in opposition to Hitler's right-wing faction. And owing to Strasser's influence, Goebbels was appointed as a spokesman for the party in the Rhineland region where he originally hailed from in 1924. His role as a propagandist for the party also began at this time, as he was sent to start work as a writer and editor for the party newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, or the People's Observer. In these years of the mid-1920s, Goebbels found himself increasingly drawn into an internal struggle within the Nazi regime over the ideological future of the party. This was driven by a split between Hitler, who favored a hard-line anti-Semitic, nationalist approach with only a limited emphasis on socialism, and Strasser. Goebbels' diaries revealed that he had sympathized with both sides. He was drawn to the more socially grounded outlook of Strasser, but he increasingly favored Hitler from late 1925 onwards, having read Hitler's anti-Semitic biography, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which Hitler had written while serving his prison sentence for the failed Beer Hall Putsch in 1924, and the first volume of which was published in 1925. Following multiple meetings with the charismatic Hitler at a party conference held in Bamberg in northern Bavaria on the 14th of February 1926, Goebbels became a committed adherent of the Nazi leader. It has been speculated that Goebbels was an extreme narcissist and needed a figurehead or leader of some sort from whom he could gain affirmation and approval. This would certainly explain the obsession he developed with gaining Hitler's esteem in the mid-1920s, an obsession which would characterize their relationship over the 20 years that followed. Goebbels' support for the leader bordered on zealotry, and from this point forward, Goebbels began his long association as one of Hitler's closest allies. In recognition of his rising position within the party, Goebbels was appointed as Gauleiter, or regional commander of Berlin within the Nazi Party in August 1926, a position he would hold until his eventual death in 1945. In Berlin, in an effort to promote the party in the capital, Goebbels developed many of the propaganda strategies which became hallmarks of the Nazis in the years ahead. These involved using large posters of vibrant red and black ink, often emblazoned with the swastika, the Nazi Party symbol, and with stark political messages. These banners often featured at large torchlit party rallies filled with symbolism, which became a staple of the party in the years that followed. Goebbels also founded a party newspaper called Der Angriff, or The Attack, in the capital, combining his propaganda strategy with violence and intimidation. Goebbels also had the Nazis' uniformed paramilitary body, the SA, engage in attacks and violence in beer halls in Berlin in the months that followed his appointment. As a consequence of all this work, Goebbels won election to parliament in the Reichstag elections held on the 20th of May 1928. His election was especially surprising as the Nazis generally performed poorly in these elections, particularly in the cities, and their power base was largely confined to the Munich region of Bavaria and some parts of the countryside by 1928. The attitude of the new Reichstag deputy towards parliamentary democracy was stark, having stated, "We are entering the Reichstag in order that we may arm ourselves with the weapons of democracy from its arsenal. We shall become Reichstag deputies in order that the Weimar ideology should itself help us to destroy it." Goebbels' statements that the Nazis could undermine the German Republic from within Parliament itself may have seemed fanciful given the party's election result in 1928, but all this began to change in 1929. After years of rapid economic growth in the 1920s, the United States stock market began to overheat and collapse in the autumn of 1929. Starting in September, share prices began to fall, culminating on the 25th of October with the largest one-day selling off of shares in US history. What became known as Black Friday was the peak of the Wall Street crash. It ushered in the Great Depression, which would see economies all over the world impacted in the years ahead. Still suffering from its war debt and other political and economic problems, Germany was particularly susceptible to the problems created by the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. And in the years ahead, as the German economy contracted and millions of Germans lost either their jobs or their savings, the Nazi Party, with its message of resentment and xenophobia, would grow in popularity. The first major electoral boom occurred in 1930. An election was called in the spring for the 14th of September 1930. Goebbels was central to the Nazis' electoral campaign, shaping the party's message around opposition to the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which had ended the First World War, and the humiliating terms of which Germany continued to suffer under. Thousands of meetings were held countrywide. In the resulting election, the Nazis went from being a minor party, which had actually lost support in the 1928 election, to the second largest party in Germany, with nearly 1 in 5 voters supporting them. This translated into 107 seats in the 577-seat Reichstag. Only the centrist Social Democratic Party won more seats, taking 143. The Social Democratic Party were consequently in a position to lead the government. Significantly, the Communist Party of Germany came in third in the election, winning 77 seats. As such, the extremist parties won a great share of the vote in this election. As the effects of the Great Depression hit home in Germany, the rise of the Communists also allowed the Nazis to depict themselves in the years ahead as a bulwark against a potential communist takeover of Germany. As one of the Nazis' chief propagandists, Goebbels was central to efforts to exploit fears over a communist surge in the years ahead. Between 1930 and the next Reichstag elections, the Berlin Gauleiter was developing new methods of disseminating the Nazi message. He began experimenting with the new medium of silent films, something which would play a central role in spreading the Nazis' ideology and wartime propaganda in the 1930s and 1940s. The radio was also exploited effectively by Goebbels. When Hitler ran unsuccessfully for the office of German president in 1932, Goebbels oversaw the broadcasting of regular radio messages, detailing the Führer's almost daily plane journeys around Germany to torchlit parades where he stirred up increasing support amongst Protestants, middle-class business owners, and women. These were groups in German society who increasingly favoured the Nazis as the German banking system neared collapse in 1931, and efforts by the centrist administration in Berlin to negotiate German debt relief with Britain and France failed. Although Hitler lost the 1932 presidential election to Paul von Hindenburg, a German hero of the First World War, the Nazi leader, buoyed by Goebbels' propaganda and election strategizing, had nevertheless performed very well, coming a close second to von Hindenburg. It was inevitable that this newfound support for the party would translate into greater electoral success when a new Reichstag election took place. New elections were imminent by 1932. In their efforts to ensure that both the Nazis and the Communists were kept out of government, a coalition of centrist parties had been operating minority governments for months. When the first election since 1930 was held, on the 31st of July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany for the first time. This was largely owing to socio-economic circumstances. The unemployment rate in Germany had reached nearly 30% by 1932. People's savings had been obliterated, the banking system was on the verge of total collapse, and the centrist governments had seemed incapable of arresting the situation, despite successfully negotiating to have the majority of Germany's war reparations debt cancelled. By expertly manipulating popular resentment and anger at the prevailing economic conditions, the Nazi Party won 230 seats in the July 1932 Reichstag elections. Thus, the Nazis, along with Goebbels, a major driving force behind their propaganda and election campaigns, had ascended to become the dominant party in Germany by the summer of 1932. Nearly 2 out of every 5 voters had supported Hitler and his party. However, they lacked a majority in parliament, and negotiations with some of the more centrist parties to establish a coalition broke down in the autumn of 1932. Consequently, Germans had to return to the polls in November 1932 for the second time that year. The Reichstag elections held on the 6th of November 1932 were the last free and fair elections held in Germany prior to the establishment of the German Third Reich. Although the Nazis lost votes, they yet again emerged as the largest party, winning 196 seats and 1 in 3 votes. The elections of November 1932 continued the parliamentary stalemate, yet a solution was in the making. For several months, an uneasy alliance, but an alliance nonetheless, had been developing between the Nazi Party and some centrist political forces, along with the powerful industrial lobbyists who ran German business. The latter were wary of the Nazis, but were prepared to countenance supporting Hitler and the party Goebbels had become the leading propagandist for, if the Nazis could prevent the rise of the parties of the left in Germany. As such, the industrialists and centrists agreed to do business with the Nazis in 1932, in an effort to prevent the further rise of the Communist Party and their allies on the left of the political spectrum. The spectre of Soviet Russia, where the Communists had risen to power following the Russian Revolution of 1917, hung large over Germany in 1932. Inadvertently, it would facilitate the rise of Hitler and the destruction of the Weimar Republic. Following extensive negotiations, a coalition of the Nazis, centre parties, and industrialists was finally concluded on the 30th of January 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the head of the government, and the Nazis were given 3 of the 11 cabinet positions. Goebbels was frustrated not to receive one of these positions, but he would not have to wait long. To mark the event, he oversaw a huge torchlit parade in Berlin on the night of the 30th of January 1933, attended by approximately 60,000 supporters of the Nazis. It featured brigades of SS and SA members, the paramilitary branches of the Nazi Party, and would prefigure the military parades which would become ubiquitous in Germany for the next 12 years of Nazi rule. The new government moved quickly to consolidate its power. Punitive measures to repress the Communist Party and other parties of the left were quickly implemented in February 1933. A fire at the Reichstag on the 28th of February was then used as a pretext for passing emergency legislation, which briefly gave the government additional powers, and a snap Reichstag election was called for the 5th of March. Voter intimidation and fraud was employed in the resulting campaign, but the Nazis were still only able to win 44% of the vote, which translated into 288 seats in the Reichstag. This, however, was enough. On the 23rd of March 1933, the Nazis excluded the Communists and others from the Reichstag, and intimidated several other parties in order to ensure that an enabling act was passed by an overwhelming majority through both houses of the parliament. This enabling act decreed that the German Chancellor and his government could effectively suspend the government and rule by decree over a period of 4 years. The passage of it through the Reichstag effectively spelled the end of the Weimar Republic and the establishment of single-party Nazi rule in Germany. Goebbels did not have to wait until the passage of the Enabling Act to acquire the ministerial position he had long sought. On the 14th of March 1933, Hitler appointed Goebbels as head of the newly created Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Over the next 12 years, and for the duration of the German Third Reich, Goebbels would enforce Nazi ideology throughout Germany and Europe through his ministry. Goebbels' thoughts on propaganda and its uses was perhaps best expressed in a speech entitled The Art of Propaganda, which he made before the political education seminar of the Nazi Party in Berlin on the 9th of January 1928. Here he stated, "Propaganda shows that it is good if, over a certain period of it, can win over and fire up people for an idea. If it fails to do so, it is bad propaganda. If propaganda wins the people it wanted to win, it is presumably good. And if not, it was presumably bad. No one can say that your propaganda is too crude or low or brutal, or that it is not decent enough, for those are not the relevant criteria. Its purpose is not to be decent, or gentle, or weak, or modest. It is to be successful." Thus, Goebbels' view was clear. The end always justified the means when it came to state propaganda, and any methods, however crude or deceptive, could be used if they furthered Hitler's and the wider Nazi Party's ideological goals. A sense of the scale of control which Goebbels hoped to exercise over German life through his ministry can be glimpsed by examining the organizational structure of his department. It was divided into multiple branches which variously dealt with broadcasting, the national and foreign press, films, censorship, the arts, music and theatre, mass rallies, race issues, indoctrination of German youth, and counter-offensives against anything which was deemed to be foreign or domestic propaganda directed against the Nazi state. Over the next 12 years, from its headquarters across from Hitler's own offices in the Reich Chancellery, Goebbels would shape the ideology of the Nazi Party and the Third Reich. Goebbels' propaganda methods were immensely varied. One of his first major acts was the massive repression of German art and culture. Writers and artists who were considered anti-German in their actions were silenced, and their works destroyed or suppressed. Goebbels was also central to a series of mass book burnings, which swept through Germany shortly after the ascent to power of the Nazis, the foremost occurrence being on the 10th of May 1933. That evening, German students in Berlin oversaw the burning of over 25,000 books which were deemed un-German. These included works by Karl Marx, Erich Maria Remarque, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud. Goebbels was central to the events in Berlin on the 10th of May, and gave a speech before thousands of people in which he encouraged the crowd to reject the moral corruption which such books instilled, suffusing his oration with the anti-Semitism which was the trademark of the Nazi Party. He stated at the event in Berlin that the era of Jewish intellectualism is at an end. These events showed how far Goebbels had drifted from his earlier life. The PhD student and would-be writer of 1921 had become the overseer of mass book burnings and cultural destruction. Unsurprisingly, in the years ahead, many prominent authors such as Thomas Mann began to leave Germany. Goebbels continued in these years to mold German culture to the goals of Nazi ideology, using the Reich Chamber of Culture, which was established in September 1933. The arts were subordinated to the Nazi cause. For instance, new films being produced in Germany henceforward often had a Nazi message, sometimes a subtle one, but one which aided the Nazi cause. Much of this sought to portray Hitler as the savior of Europe against the threat of Bolshevism and communism taking power in Germany and elsewhere on the continent. Goebbels' control over the German film industry became absolute in March 1937, when the German film industry was nationalized and came virtually entirely under his ministry's control. Around this time, he stated his views on how cinema could be used as an art which expresses an attitude through its National Socialist character, and by taking up National Socialist problems, but should do so in a way that did not appear deliberate and remains in the background. Even more consequential was Goebbels' exploitation and control over the national press and methods of communication. Germany had more papers than almost all other European countries under the Weimar Republic, but under Goebbels' ministry, the Nazi Party effectively took control over the major newspapers. Journalists were briefed by Goebbels' ministry and often had what they printed dictated to them by the party apparatus. Journalists who diverged from the Nazi message were often intimidated or arrested. His control of and exploitation of the new and emerging types of mass media was even more comprehensive. Under his leadership, the Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda distributed millions of radios to Germans. This was the mass medium which Goebbels preferred for indoctrination of the German people. In the first year of full Nazi rule alone, over 50 of Hitler's speeches were broadcast on radio. The emerging medium of film was also exploited in this way. Loudspeakers were set up in public places throughout Germany so that state messages could be drilled into people in public places. Goebbels was also central to the organization of the huge Nazi Party rallies which were held throughout Germany in the years ahead. The most infamous example was the 1934 Nazi Party Congress rallies at Nuremberg, the events of which were immortalized in the propaganda film of the same, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, The Triumph of the Will, which won many film awards around Europe in the 1930s and has been called one of the most effective pieces of political propaganda ever made. The effect, over time, of this constant affirmation of the Nazi message was immense. In their rise to power, the Nazis had never been able to attain the support of more than about a third of the German people. In the last three Reichstag elections in November 1933, the party had gleaned only 1/3 of the votes. However, by the late 1930s, in large part owing to Goebbels' propaganda work, the Nazis had become more popular countrywide, and faith in Hitler's leadership was immense. As a result, when the referendum was held on the 19th of August 1934 to appoint Hitler officially as Führer, or leader of Germany, with the combined offices of Chancellor and President, it was passed by an overwhelming majority of 88% in favor, a result which was only partly fraudulent, indicating the growing popularity of the Nazis. And in the months and years after their rise to power, there is little doubt that Goebbels' work as a propagandist was highly successful after the Nazis seized power in the 1930s. At the same time, Goebbels' own political power was growing in the 1930s. He was generally disliked by his colleagues in government. Indeed, an article in Life magazine in 1938 noted that Goebbels likes nobody, is liked by nobody, and runs the most efficient Nazi department. Despite his aloofness towards most of his colleagues, he was one of Hitler's closest confidants. When Hitler decided to combine the offices of German Chancellor and President of Germany following the death of the President, Paul von Hindenburg, in August 1934, it was Goebbels who made the announcement by radio to the German nation on the 2nd of August. As well as this, Hitler had become close with Goebbels' family. On the 19th of December 1931, Goebbels had married Magda Ritschl. They had numerous children in the 1930s, and the family became referred to as the first family of the Reich, Hitler having remained a bachelor without children. Other signs of Goebbels' prominence in the regime followed. For instance, he was appointed as president of the organizing committee for the Summer and Winter Olympics when they were held in Berlin in 1936, a major role which put him center stage in Germany for an international event. Goebbels was also involved in the growing persecution of Germany's Jewish population in the years following the Nazis' ascent to power. His anti-Semitism was long-standing and was one of the reasons why he had been attracted to the Nazi Party and Hitler in the 1920s. Yet there were also contradictions to Goebbels' anti-Semitism. In his student years, he had a close relationship with several Jewish teachers for a time, and he dated Else Yanker, a Jewish school teacher. For several years in the early 1920s, he even considered marrying her. Despite these contradictions in his attitudes towards German Jewry, Goebbels quickly became one of the most enthusiastic persecutors of Germany's Jews following the Nazis' ascent to power in 1933. In October of that year, he was responsible for passing the Reich Press Law, through which all Jewish editors were removed from working at German newspapers and other print outlets. Throughout these years, there were repeated references in his diaries to efforts to de-Jewify German culture. When a set of laws known as the Nuremberg Laws were passed on the 15th of September 1935, effectively prohibiting Jews from holding German citizenship and from marrying Germans, Goebbels had propaganda pieces published in outlets such as the newspaper Der Stürmer. Justifying the prohibitions and attacks on Germany's Jews, his propaganda continued to feed the Nazi state's growing anti-Semitism in the years ahead, as the first concentration camps were set up in Germany to house political prisoners, including many Jews. In early November 1938, Goebbels was central to the worst anti-Semitic pogrom in Germany prior to the outbreak of the war. On the 7th of November 1938, a Jewish teenager, Herschel Greenspan, shot a German diplomat, Ernst von Rath, at the German embassy in Paris. Von Rath died 2 days later on the 9th of November. Later that evening, Goebbels gave a speech at a commemorative event marking the 15-year anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, in which he made it clear that spontaneous acts of violence and attacks on Jews and their property would be tolerated by the government in response to von Rath's death. A later report stated that Goebbels' speech had clearly been intended to indicate that while the Nazi Party and the government did not wish to be seen as perpetuating retaliations on the Jewish community, it was essentially stating that they should be organized and carried out on an unofficial basis. What followed was an orgy of violence on the night of the 9th of November 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, as it has become known, saw the Nazi paramilitary forces and gangs of German citizens attack Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues throughout Germany. Approximately 100 Jews were murdered in the hours of violence, over 200 synagogues were ransacked or destroyed, and as many as 7,000 Jewish businesses had windows broken or worse damage inflicted. Perhaps as many as 30,000 Jews were also detained on fabricated charges and confined to the new concentration camps, which were proliferating around Germany. The psychological effects were even worse, and Jews thereafter in Germany were aware that they were a people under perpetual attack in Germany. It is estimated that several hundred Jews committed suicide in the days and weeks following the pogrom, and many Jewish families began to consider leaving Germany. However, Kristallnacht was a portent of worse to come. While Goebbels was one of the most ardent supporters and actors in Germany's growing anti-Semitic policies, he was less enthusiastic about the Nazi state's drift towards war in the late 1930s. The Nazis had long been committed to re-establishing German military power, in contravention of the heavy restrictions placed on the size of the German army and air force under the terms of the Versailles Treaty. From 1933 onwards, Hitler and the Nazi leadership began expanding the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and the German Army, the Wehrmacht. And on the 7th of March 1936, German troops were sent into the Rhineland region of Western Germany, which had been established as a demilitarized zone under the terms of Versailles. Further aggression followed in the years ahead. On the 12th of March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, uniting the two German-speaking countries under Nazi rule. The Anschluss, as it became known, made clear Germany's aggressive intentions in Europe, and the other European powers were increasingly fearful of war from early 1938 onwards. However, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, tried to pacify Hitler through concessions in the months ahead, particularly as the Nazis began pressing a claim to the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938. On the 14th of September 1938, Goebbels pushed an aggressive editorial in the Völkischer Beobachter, promoting German claims to the region, owing to the large number of ethnically German people living there. Eventually, in early October 1938, Germany was ceded the Sudetenland in return for a guarantee that Hitler would otherwise respect Czechoslovakia's independence. This was breached in early March 1939 as Germany invaded Czechoslovakia. In the days ahead, the country and neighbouring Hungary were variously either annexed by Germany or formed into satellite, vassal states. Thus, by the spring of 1939, the Nazis had established themselves as masters of all of Central Europe. But Britain and France were now clear that Hitler and Germany could not be pacified. As a consequence, when the Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. On the 3rd of September 1939, the Second World War had commenced. In its initial stages, the war was a resounding success for Germany. Poland was quickly overrun and divided up between Germany and Soviet Russia in the autumn of 1939, with whom a non-aggression pact had been agreed, despite the ideological differences between the fascist Nazis and the communist Russians. The following April, Denmark and Norway were invaded and quickly conquered. Then, on the night of the 9th of May 1940, after months of military build-up in Western Germany, the Wehrmacht received orders to invade France through the Low Countries of the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Over the next 5 weeks, there followed a complete military collapse of France. Paris was captured on the 14th of June 1940, effectively ending the military campaign. And on the 25th of June, an armistice was signed as a preliminary to establishing a puppet government in France. Germany had effectively conquered Western Europe. Britain had only barely managed to pull its army out of mainland Europe and back to Britain in time, undertaking a daring naval evacuation of over 300,000 troops from the port town of Dunkirk in northern France between the 26th of May and the 4th of June. Consequently, Britain was able to continue in the war, and Germany would have to undertake a protracted effort to weaken its resolve through bombing campaigns in 1940 and 1941. The Blitz, as this campaign became known, was ultimately unsuccessful. Despite these early successes, Goebbels was less enthusiastic about the prospects of war in 1939 than many of the other senior members of the Nazi Party. At times, he was entirely realistic. For instance, an entry in his diaries in April 1940 noted, "We must achieve victory in the course of this year, otherwise the material superiority of the opposite side would become too strong." A war of many years would also be difficult to maintain for psychological reasons. Nevertheless, he was central to the war effort. The Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was effectively responsible for shaping the state's message about the war effort and what German citizens were told about what was happening in 1939 and 1940. From the start of the invasion of the Low Countries and France in May 1940, Goebbels wrote and published editorials which were broadcast nationally on German radio and often published in newspapers. For instance, between May 1940 and the spring of 1945, Goebbels published 218 editorials in the newspaper he had founded, Das Reich, or The Empire. This was published weekly. So Goebbels' writings glorifying the war effort and denouncing Germany's enemies were rarely absent from any edition of the paper. As the war progressed, Goebbels also increasingly exploited the medium of film to glorify the German war effort at home and abroad. Films of the German armies progressing through Poland and France became staples of German life, though these depictions of German valor would have to be increasingly doctored from late 1941 onwards, as the German army began to suffer increasing setbacks. And as it did, Goebbels' job increasingly became about managing the expectations of the German people. What was needed from the spring of 1942 onwards was resolve, in a war that would not be over soon, and which was almost certainly doomed to end in German defeat. Goebbels was also central to the increasingly barbaric methods being used to persecute the Jews of Germany and occupied Europe. On the 30th of January 1939, Hitler had delivered a speech in the Reichstag which Goebbels had been involved in writing, in which it was declared that if Europe was cast into war, the Jewish people would be held responsible by the Nazi state, and the annihilation of the Jews of Europe would be undertaken. In the years ahead, this threat was put into action. Following the conquest of Poland, a huge ghetto, largely populated by Poland's considerable Jewish population, was established in Warsaw in October 1939. The following month, Polish Jews were legally required to wear armbands or yellow stars to indicate they were Jews. This stipulation would eventually be imposed in Germany by Goebbels' express orders in September 1941, and on the 20th of May 1940, a concentration camp was established at Auschwitz in southern Poland, a place which would become the epicenter of the Holocaust which followed in the years ahead. However, the most terrible moment in the Nazi state persecution of the Jewish people did not come until 1942. On the 20th of January 1942, at a conference at Wannsee, a Berlin suburb, it was effectively decided by the Nazi Party to begin exterminating the Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe. The final solution, as it became known, resulted in the Holocaust of approximately 6 million Jews between 1942 and the end of the war in 1945. There is no doubting the significance of Goebbels' role in the persecution of Europe's Jews, the development of the final solution, and the Holocaust in general. In a radio address he made on the 16th of November 1941, as a more extreme approach towards the Jews was being developed within the Nazi hierarchy, Goebbels made his views clear. In an outlandish address, he claimed that the Jews were responsible for the war which now enveloped all of Europe and much of the wider world. The Jews, Goebbels asserted, were receiving a penalty that is certainly hard, but more than deserved. Going on, he stated that the Jews must be removed from the German community, for they endanger our national unity. This is an elementary principle of racial, national, and social hygiene. Who cares about their difficulties? There is no doubting that Goebbels' anti-Semitism was extreme by the early 1940s. This manifested itself further in the production of anti-Semitic propaganda films during the war years, such as The Eternal Jew, a film made in 1940, in which Jews were depicted as parasites who were undermining social and political order. These efforts by Goebbels to sway public opinion against the Jews of Germany and Europe was largely responsible for creating an environment in which hundreds of thousands of people were at least partially complicit in the murder of millions of Europe's Jews in the years that followed. Moreover, there is no doubt that he was entirely aware of what was occurring at Auschwitz and the other extermination and labor camps of Eastern and Central Europe. Having received the details of the Wannsee Conference in early March 1942, Goebbels noted in his diary that he assumed about 40% of the Jews in these camps would be put to work producing armaments and other war material, but in a chilling turn of phrase he stated that the other 60% would almost certainly be liquidated. There is no doubt that Goebbels was one of the central architects of the sustained policy of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust itself. Indeed, as the Jews of Berlin were being deported to the concentration camps from the capital in early summer of 1942, Goebbels urged Hitler to speed up this process. He mused at this time that it might even be better to liquidate them in Berlin itself, as this would be more efficient than shipping them to the camps. As the final solution was being developed, German fortunes in the war were declining. In the summer of 1941, Hitler turned his attentions away from Britain and Western Europe towards the east. It was now time, he believed, to confront Bolshevik Russia and acquire Lebensraum, or living space for the German people in Eastern Europe. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was initiated, and an army of 3 million Germans invaded Russia. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe crumbled, as the poorly trained and equipped Russian armies were devastated by the oncoming German forces. By the autumn, the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, was contemplating negotiating peace terms, whereby the Soviet state would cede much of Eastern Europe to the German Third Reich. But at this point, Hitler's ambitions got the better of him, and envisaging a total victory over Bolshevism, he directed further drives towards the major Russian cities of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. This was to be the fatal moment for the Third Reich. As the Russian winter of 1941 set in, the German army's progress eastward slowed, confronted by a Russian army that suffered enormous casualties, but which had a seemingly never-ending stream of manpower, and improperly supplied with winter clothing and arms, which could not withstand the Russian winter. The German Wehrmacht began to experience significant setbacks on the Eastern Front. Goebbels became central to these events in many ways. For instance, on the 17th of December 1941, he was placed in charge of the drive in Germany to collect winter clothing to be sent to the Eastern Front as a matter of urgency. By the spring of 1942, a stalemate had set in on the fronts near Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, with the latter city experiencing one of the bloodiest and most catastrophic sieges in modern warfare. More and more resources were pumped into Stalingrad as the winter of 1942 neared, and the region became the crucible of war, in which the confrontation between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia would be decided. When the siege eventually ended in victory for the Soviets in early 1943, the result of the war was sealed. The Russians henceforth were now on the offensive, and began the long, inexorable campaign westwards towards Berlin, reconquering on their way all the lands of Eastern and Central Europe that the Nazis had occupied between 1939 and 1941. This reversal in fortunes for the Third Reich was further compounded in the years ahead, as a southern front was first opened in Italy when a combined British and American force invaded Sicily on the 10th of July 1943, and then a western front was established when the Western Allies invaded France on D-Day on the 6th of June 1944. Goebbels took an ever more important role in the war effort from 1942 onwards. As these escalating military reverses began, recent research has highlighted how several members of the Nazi leadership became increasingly incapacitated from 1942 by various illnesses and even drug addiction, particularly so in the case of both Hitler and the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, the latter of whom was heavily addicted to opiates. As Hitler sank into a miasma of delusion about German war prospects and needed ever greater amounts of painkillers to alleviate various ailments, more and more of the day-to-day direction of government in Berlin fell on Goebbels' shoulders, particularly as Hitler was increasingly ensconced in a military bunker in Poland. Goebbels was one of the most clear-sighted of the German leadership. Hitler was broadly delusional about the prospects of victory until late in the war, but as early as 1942, Goebbels was aware of the unlikelihood of victory, now that the Russian campaign had stalled in 1941, and the German army was unlikely to win the war on the Eastern Front. This was made clearer in the winter of 1942 when the tide was turned in Russia, with German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. As a consequence, from the spring of 1943, Goebbels began arguing for what he termed total war, by which he meant that all of the state's resources would be employed to the maximum degree possible to fight the war. At a meeting of the Nazi faithful at the Berlin Sportpalast, a huge sports stadium in the capital, on the 18th of February 1943, Goebbels laid out his belief about what was needed in what has been deemed his most famous speech. Germans would have to live a Spartan, exhausting way of life henceforward, Goebbels asserted in his speech, which was broadcast nationally on radio. He argued that Germans would have to work 14 or 16-hour days to keep up the war machine, but this was necessary to keep Europe from falling almost entirely under the control of Bolshevik Russia. Having stirred up the thousands of attendees who were selected for their Nazi credentials, he ended by asking the frenzied crowd, "Do you want total war?" Although Hitler was won over by the idea of total war, He would take until the 23rd of July 1944 before he officially appointed Goebbels as Reich Plenipotentiary for the total war effort. This was just 3 days after an attempted coup by senior members of the Wehrmacht, which had sought to assassinate Hitler and end the war, had failed. Shocked by the coup effort, Hitler committed himself to Goebbels' extreme plan for total war just days later. With this new position, Goebbels was charged with overseeing the deployment of all parts of society to facilitate the army's efforts. The position was a major confirmation of Goebbels' seniority in the Nazi leadership, with the promotion essentially being an acknowledgement that Goebbels had supplanted Hermann Göring as Hitler's second in command of the Nazi Party, and was now his ostensible successor should he die. Goebbels' efforts to put his ideas on total war into effect in the weeks and months ahead met with mixed results. He focused first on increasing the numbers of men entering the armed forces. The numbers of the rank and file in the German Wehrmacht had fallen drastically in 1942 and 1943, owing to huge casualties on the Eastern Front, and, with the opening of additional fronts by the Allies in France and Italy, the German army was stretched extremely thin by 1944. To combat this, Goebbels increased the age limit to which German women were required to work in German factories producing war material of all kinds from 45 to 55. This had the benefit of freeing up many men who had been working in the factories for active service on the front. Yet in the end, these measures were not effective. The German state was simply too under-resourced and not possessed of sufficient manpower by 1944, and the additional men who were conscripted into the German army were simply replacing those who were dying or being captured on a daily basis, as the Russians advanced from the east and the Americans and the British from the west and the south. Ultimately, total war achieved little other than the further impoverishment of the German people and the conscription of old men and boys into the German army in the last desperate stages of the war in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945. Yet Goebbels never wavered. The last of his 218 wartime editorials in Das Reich called for resistance to the very end, even as the Soviet armies closed in on central Berlin. In January 1945, the Soviet forces crossed into eastern Germany, and the Americans and British simultaneously advanced into the Rhineland in western Germany. Following a bitter struggle in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944 and January 1945, German defeat was clearly just months away, and Hitler and the Nazi leadership were now hoping that a falling out might occur between the English-speaking Allies and the Russians, which might work in Germany's favour. This never came. And in the spring of 1945, the only question was whether the Russians advancing from the east or the British and Americans from the west would seize Berlin. Despite these setbacks, Goebbels' commitment to total war never wavered. It was expressed most forcefully in the final weeks of the war, in an article in Das Reich magazine published on the 22nd of April 1945 entitled "Resistance at Any Price." Here Goebbels' fanaticism and willingness to let everything in Germany be destroyed in defense of the remnants of the Reich is laid bare. The war has reached a stage at which only the full efforts of the nation and of each individual can save us. The defense of our freedom no longer depends on the army fighting at the front. Each civilian, each man and woman and boy and girl fight with unequaled fanaticism. No village and no city may give in to the enemy. Perhaps it is his unwavering fanaticism and commitment to the Nazi cause in the final days of the Third Reich which led Hitler to appoint his propaganda minister as his successor when the Führer took the decision to end his life on the 30th of April 1945. Goebbels' few hours as head of the German state were a ghastly conclusion to his own life. On the 1st of May, a day after Hitler's suicide, he sent an offer for a ceasefire to General Vasily Zhukov, the head of the Soviet army's assault on Berlin. When this was rejected, he decided to follow his master's example. Later that day, Joseph and Magda Goebbels had their 6 children sedated with morphine, before killing their children by force-feeding them cyanide. Once they had lost consciousness, Joseph and Magda then headed upstairs where they committed suicide themselves in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Thus died the mastermind of so much of the Nazi Party's ideology. Few individuals were as critical in shaping the Third Reich as Joseph Goebbels. Both prior to the party coming to power and as Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. In the years ahead, he shaped how the Nazi message was presented to German citizens and the wider world. The visual image we have of the Nazi Party as being visually dominated by huge parades with massive Nazi banners in red and black is almost entirely owing to how Goebbels choreographed and designed these events, and the public view of the Nazis. From 1939, he was the decisive figure in deciding what information on the war effort was provided to German citizens and how it was presented. He also pushed for an increasingly fanatical, all-out war as plenipotentiary for total war. Moreover, he was one of the central individuals in the evolution of the final solution and the Holocaust of Europe's Jews. A zealous adherent of Hitler's, Goebbels was perhaps the most clear-sighted of the Nazi leadership about the prospects of German victory in the Second World War, and yet his fanatical adherence to the Führer and the tenets of National Socialism led him to favor dragging Europe to the brink of utter destruction. Given how close his ideology was to Hitler's own, it was perhaps unsurprising that the Führer appointed him as his successor in April 1945. What do you think of Joseph Goebbels? Was he merely a cog in Hitler's government, or was he a critical figure in the Third Reich who shaped Nazi policy and how state propaganda was implemented in the 20th century? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.